So, as I said, our speaker today is Kenneth Alford, Associate Professor of Church History and Doctrine here at BYU. He has been here since 2008 or 2009? 2008. He came to BYU after serving as an active duty Army officer for 29 years, retiring with the rank of colonel. While in the Army, he taught at the United States Military Academy at West Point, and West Point, New York, and at the National Defense University in Washington, D.C. He earned a BA degree from BYU, an MA from the University of Southern California, a Master of Computer Science degree from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and a PhD from George Mason University, and he earned that PhD in 2000. In all this time, he taught seminary for many years, I guess, Seminary and Institute, as a CES volunteer for many years. And so, as I mentioned, his latest book is entitled Civil War Saints. It was published in 2012. And so the title of his presentation today, as you see, is Utah and the Civil War. After his presentation, we invite you to visit our special collections. If you have not seen the major exhibit that we have in place, it's a wonderful exhibit. We'd like you to see it. And we've also put out some new material. Jeff, who gave our opening prayer, found some new material just yesterday. When I indicated to him we'd like to have a little display, and he did it. So we placed a few cases. As you walk into the special collections area, off to your left, there's a few cases with material that we just put out yesterday, including the 3 books that you might mention in your talk. So please join me today in welcoming Professor Kenneth Alford.
Well, thank you. Appreciate your being here. The Civil War, when I was a child, the centennial of the Civil War occurred, and we were living here in Utah up in Ogden. And it was quite a big deal in the state. There were all kinds of events. I remember as a child there being a lot of activities. And I was hoping that the same thing would occur with the sesquicentennial on the 150th anniversary. But it's been met with a much quieter, I guess 50 more years as it has passed, has dimmed a little bit the enthusiasm, I think, of the people out here in the West. Because the general feeling when it comes to the Civil War is that Utah met it with a collective yawn. It didn't affect us. It was too far away, and we just kind of let it be water off our back. That's not the case at all. The Civil War deeply, deeply affected the saints that lived here, as well as the folks that passed through. But in order to look at this, we need to start before the Civil War. We actually need to start with the Utah War. I won't go into a history of the Utah War. There's many things you can read about that, and a great chapter in the book, Civil War Saints, that talks about that. But the Utah War, you have to understand, deeply affects the Civil War. The South is able to arm and establish their armies to large measure because a good portion of the United States Army, up to a quarter of all of the soldiers, are sitting outside of Salt Lake City. So as the war begins, they're thousands of miles from the battlefields, and they have to be brought back at great expense over several months, and they're coming out of Utah. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, because the largest army post in the entire nation is known as Camp Floyd in Utah Territory. And it's what is called Fairfield today, just on the other side of Utah Lake. You may have heard of Johnston's army. Well, this is Albert Sidney Johnston. Johnston's army is named after him, and they come and occupy the area in 1857. So as we look at this, just to let you see that Utah is playing kind of an interesting role during the war. This is a Harper's Weekly 1861 woodcut that appeared in the Harper's Weekly, one of their issues, there are all of the states from the United States listed at the time, and only one territory. Now, there were 7 territories in the nation, but only one of the territories got listed on this Harper's Weekly chart. And to point it out, there it is. Utah Territory is just in the consciousness of the nation, and we'll show you that as we get into this, because of the Utah War and because of polygamy and because things are just so unusual here in Utah. As we look at this, as Scott mentioned, there have been previous works looking at Utah and the Civil War. The first book that's now out on display was done by Margaret Fisher, and it was done in 1929. It's a really interesting book. Her husband was a Civil War veteran, and so she was writing it from his reminiscences, and she met with several people that had served in the war. She also quotes from several diaries. We found the original text of those diaries, and some of the diaries she actually even quoted some of the words that are in the diaries. She was very, very, how can I be kind to Margaret? She was very, very interested in using different standards than currently apply for academic research. She made stuff up. But it's an interesting book, and it does give us an interesting insight, and there's not a single footnote in the entire book. So it's a researcher's nightmare and treasure chest all at the same time. In 1981, E.B. Long published this book, The Saints and the Union. This is a straight historical review of the Civil War in Utah Territory. And in looking at this, living on the East Coast, as I was preparing to retire from the Army, the Civil War is just omnipresent. We were living in Northern Virginia. Manassas was 20 minutes from our home. Fredericksburg was 20 minutes from our home. Harper's Ferry was an hour from our home. Gettysburg was 80 minutes from our home. I mean, it's just, the Civil War is just omnipresent. And in looking at this, I thought, gosh, let's see if anything new has been uncovered in the last 30 years since E.B. Long did his book. And I started recognizing that all kinds of material had been identified. As well as I got checking, and no one had ever tried to identify the LDS Civil War veterans. So I thought, it's been 150 years, it's time we correct that. And that's one of the things that we've put into this Civil War Saints, is we've identified 384 Latter-day Saints who served in the war, and we have biographical and other information on those great folks. Well, before we start talking about Utah, I'd like to correct 2 common misperceptions about the Civil War. And the first is when the war started. This is April 12th, 1861, so this is a view of what? Fort Sumter. Everybody's mouthing Fort Sumter. And that's traditionally where we say the war started. But actually, and I was tipped off to this when we lived at West Point, the library at West Point, outside the main entrance, the old main entrance to the library, had 2 cannons mounted on the wall. From the first shot fired in the Civil War and the last shot fired in the Civil War, and they're just mounted on the wall there for the cadets to pass and ignore. And the first cannon was not from Fort Sumter. And so I was curious of where that might be from, and I will tell you a quick story before we move on, though, since I had just mentioned West Point. This is Robert Anderson. He was the Union commander of Fort Sumter. This is PGT, Pierre Gusant Toutant Beauregard, a very Southern aristocratic gentleman who makes 4 stars in the Confederate Army. But Beauregard had been a cadet of Anderson's at West Point, and he learned artillery at the Plains of West Point from his instructor, Major Anderson. And Anderson lamented during the bombardment of Fort Sumter that he said, I wish I wasn't quite as good of instructor as I was, because Beauregard is hitting the fort with good effect, and they eventually had to surrender. But in looking at this, actually, the first artillery shots fired in anger in the Civil War are fired clear back in January, more than 3 months prior to Fort Sumter. Interestingly enough, it occurs in the same harbor, Charleston Harbor, where Fort Sumter sits. A Union supply ship, USS Star of the West, was taking supplies to Fort Sumter when it came under artillery fire from a Southern artillery unit. The reason that we count Fort Sumter as the start of the war is because the Union forces did not return fire. The Star of the West was unarmed and was unable to return fire. But it was the first artillery shots fired in anger. Just by way of an aside, in some research for a Utah War paper that I did, I found out that Star of the West, this is an 1857 newspaper article, from the Deseret News, and from the New York Times. Star of the West brought our mail to Utah from the West Coast in the years prior to the Civil War, and then it just happened to have gone around the horn again and was in Charleston Harbor and helped start the Civil War. So the war actually starts then 3 months earlier than we normally say. Well, let's go to the other end. When does the war actually end? Most Americans, if you ask them, would say that the Civil War ends in Wilmer McLean's parlor at Appomattox. And this is Lee at the unconditional surrender. The guy on the left with the big handlebar mustache, that's George Armstrong Custer. He's the luckiest guy in the entire Civil War. That's another story to tell. Grant thinks so highly of Custer, by the way. That table that the aide is sitting at, that's the table that the surrender document is signed on. Grant gives that table to Custer. Out of everybody there, Custer, the youngest general in the room, gets the table, and that's actually in his parlor when he rides off to Little Bighorn. And Liddy, his wife, gives that back to the Smithsonian. You can see it there today. But the war doesn't end at Appomattox. Lee is not in a position to end the war. All Robert E. Lee commands is the Army of Northern Virginia. And so that's all he can surrender. And over the next several months, we have armies surrendering across the South. I got curious as I was researching into this. This is a medallion that was worn, a membership medal, from what's called the GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic. This was a veterans organization, kind of like Veterans of Foreign Wars or the American Legion from Civil War times. And all of the veterans would wear this, and I know you can't really see it, so I'll blow it up here. And there on the sides of this badge, it says 1861 to 1866. And my first reaction was, oh my gosh, how could the veterans who actually fought in the war goof up the date when the war ended? And then when reason took over, I realized, well, they probably didn't because they fought the war. But yet, they still considered 1866 the end of the war. So I was curious how that might be. And I got searching, and so the end of the war, well, is it June 13th when Andrew Johnson says, the war's over except Texas? No, that's not the end of the war. Is it June 23rd when Stan Wadey, a full-blooded Cherokee general for the Confederacy, surrenders in Oklahoma as the very last Confederate troops? No, that doesn't end the war. Is it April 2nd, 1866, when President Andrew Johnson signs a proclamation that says, okay, Texas is no longer in rebellion? No, that doesn't officially end the war. The war doesn't formally end until August 20th, 1866. The White House and Congress had simply not gotten around to issuing a formal proclamation declaring that the war is over everywhere and peace has broken out. And so at the time, the formal ending of the war was considered as August 20th, 1866. So the little badges were indeed correct. Well, for Latter-day Saints, one of the things that causes many of the saints to want to kind of ride out the war or not participate is Joseph's 1832 Christmas Day revelation. We know it today as Doctrine and Covenants, section 87. At the time, it is not part of the Doctrine and Covenants. It doesn't appear in the Doctrine and Covenants until 1876. Copies of it, though, pass among the members of the church and eventually reach their way into the newspaper editors' hands of the times. And during the Civil War, Joseph Smith's prophecy, section 87, was published by both North and South in their newspapers. One of them, the Philadelphia Sunday Mercury, on May 5th, 1861, published the revelation in its entirety and then makes this statement: have we not had a prophet among us? Well, we would certainly answer that yes, we have. The newspaper then just goes on and talks about the news of the day, but I thought it was a very, very interesting question. But because of that revelation, a lot of the saints see this through millennial eyes, and they think this is going to cause the dawning of the millennium, and they just feel that they should sit out. An initial LDS perspective when the war begins is kind of summed up by John Taylor. John Taylor was called back during the Utah War from the East, where he used to be a newspaper editor in New York City for the church, a newspaper called The Mormon. But John Taylor makes this statement. He said, shall we join the North to fight against the South? No. Shall we join the South against the North? As emphatically, no. Why? We know no North, no South, no East, no West. And that was the perception and the statements that were coming out. There'll be a presentation in this lecture series by Dr. Richard Bennett, my associate dean, on this very topic coming up, so I won't steal any more of his thunder. But just to let you know, this is a very prevalent view at the beginning of the war. Also at the beginning of the war, the Latter-day Saints are not very big on Abraham Lincoln. There are some very uncomplimentary statements made about Lincoln in the Deseret News and even over the pulpit in Salt Lake, and they're concerned of what Lincoln's going to do to the country. Now contrast that for just a minute. When Buchanan became president, there were very complimentary statements made both over the pulpit and in the press. And then Buchanan turned out not to be a great friend of the Latter-day Saints. But here are President Young's views himself. Right even before Fort Sumter, after South Carolina and other states are beginning to secede, South Carolina secedes in December of 1860. They're the first. But Brigham Young points out that, you know, this whole doctrine of secession, where does it end? Because if a state can secede, so can a county, so can a town, so can a family. You will have anarchy. He said it just doesn't work. One of the interesting things that happens in Utah during the Civil War is that the telegraph finally reaches Salt Lake City. It comes from the east first, arrives in Salt Lake City, and then just like the railroad, it's also coming across from the west, and it joins up in Salt Lake City in October of 1861. This is the old original Salt Lake City telegraph office there on 100 South. But after the telegraph arrived, Brigham Young takes that opportunity because Utah is no longer isolated. Prior to October 1861, we might as well have been on the far side of the moon because it took so many weeks to get mail and information back and forth that it was very difficult. But Brigham Young takes that opportunity as soon as the telegraph arrives to send this message back east. Utah has not seceded and is firm for the Constitution and the laws of our once happy country. And he tries to get the word out that we are still loyal here because it's leaking out in Washington, D.C. that the South is trying to get Utah to secede. We never entertain it. About the closest we come is we name the southern part of the state Dixie, which has been in the news recently. But that's about as close as we come. But the South has ambitions and hopes that Utah will secede because of the way we were treated in the Utah War. But Brigham and the church leaders entertained no thoughts of secession. By January of 1862, you can see Brigham Young's attitude towards the war is starting to turn to one generally of sadness along with the rest of the country as the war continues to drag on. And Brigham makes this statement. He says, "We feel much for our government. Their situation is lamentable." And as the war continues, Brigham's statements become sadder and sadder as he sees what's happening to the nation and the tremendous pain. The Civil War kills 600,000 people. For that kind of loss to occur in the nation today would take a loss of over 10 million Americans. Everyone knows someone who has died in the Civil War, including Latter-day Saints in Utah, because they still have family and friends, most of them in the Midwest or on the East Coast, and they're being seriously affected by the war, and the letters that are traveling back and forth between the territory and the states, as they call it, carry a lot of this sadness. Well, what about Abraham Lincoln and the Mormons? That question is always asked. Did Joseph Smith ever meet Abraham Lincoln? The short answer is we don't know. The little bit longer answer is there's a very good chance they may have met. We know they were both in Springfield, Illinois at the time that the Nauvoo Charter was being debated. Lincoln was a brand new legislator, and he voted in favor of the Nauvoo Charter, giving Nauvoo all of their rights, but we don't know if they ever actually met. During the Lincoln-Douglas debates of the 1860 election, Utah figures prominently in those debates. You can find the text available in the New York Times and also online, and you'll see that Utah is mentioned in multiple debates. In fact, one of the debates, Lincoln says, "I begin with Utah," and he leads off with that topic during the Lincoln-Douglas debates. During the war itself, Lincoln, if you've seen the movie Lincoln with Daniel Day-Lewis, you see that Lincoln is much more of a politician than we generally give him credit for, and he is willing to horse trade. He has a very radical Republican Congress that is in the majority, and he has to deal with them to get any legislation passed. He is willing to trade in June 1862 their vote, his signature on a Morrill Anti-Bigamy Act for Congress's votes on supplying and supporting the war. And he signs the first piece of anti-polygamy legislation in June of 1862. By June of 1863, Brigham Young is worried about this legislation and other things and wonders what Lincoln really thinks about the Latter-day Saints. So he sends Thomas B.H. Stenhouse to Washington, D.C. Stenhouse is a businessman, with the instructions to transact church business in Washington. And he says, while you're there, Thomas, I want you to get a sit-down with Lincoln, which was much easier at the time than it is today with the President of the United States. So Stenhouse goes by the White House and meets with Lincoln. Lincoln, by the way, I will tell you, the Library of Congress shows that Lincoln had checked out for a good portion of the Civil War a copy of the Book of Mormon and some other books on the church. That's just as an aside. But Stenhouse asked him directly, Mr. President, what of the Mormons? And here's the way Lincoln answers this. I always thought that Ronald Reagan kind of channeled Lincoln in the way he would answer questions with a story. And this sounds not only Lincoln-esque, but very Reagan-esque. He says, Stenhouse, when I was a boy on a farm in Illinois, there was a great deal of timber on the farm, and we had to clear it away. Occasionally, we'd come to a log, well, which had fallen down. It was too hard to split, too wet to burn, too heavy to move, so we just plowed around it. You go back and tell Brigham Young that if he will let me alone, I will let him alone. And so Lincoln knows that even though the Anti-Bigamy Act has been signed, Lincoln does not intend to prosecute. He's got other fish to fry with the war going on. And there's a really marked change of attitude from Brigham Young following June 1863, after he hears that Lincoln's just going to leave him alone in all of this. As the South begins to secede in December of 1860, we see Colonel Philip St. George Cook commanding Camp Floyd. Now, just a little aside on Philip St. George Cook, his son-in-law, his daughter, marries Jeb Stuart. That's J.E.B. Stuart, the famous Confederate cavalry commander. Philip St. George Cook is from Virginia. Yet Philip St. George Cook remains loyal throughout the entire war, makes the rank of general and goes back and serves faithfully for the Union Army. But there's some concern in the War Department that they have a Southerner, a Virginian, commanding 1/4 of the United States Army. And so he protests his loyalty very loudly. He has a history with the Latter-day Saints, too, and he's actually well received, much better than Albert Sidney Johnston was. He is involved with the Mormon Battalion and actually leads the battalion after James Allen dies in 1846. So he has a great history with the Latter-day Saints. He is commanding the camp, and then what happens is John B. Floyd, who is Secretary of War, the guy after whom they named Camp Floyd, he joins the Confederacy. Secretary of War under Buchanan defects, basically, goes over to the Confederacy. This is an envelope from 1861 showing the Hercules there, wielding the stick of the Union, and one of the Hydra heads is Floyd. And so you can't have your largest army camp named after a Confederate sympathizer, so they rename Camp Floyd as Fort Crittenden. The change from camp to fort recognizes the size of it, but Crittenden is a senator that they're trying to curry favor with, and so they name it after Crittenden. The Army at the time the war breaks out is simply patrolling the trails. They know that the war is going on in the east, but they've got nothing to do except keep an eye on the Mormons and look for Indians. And they receive orders in the summer of 1861, Cook does, that the Army is to pack up and leave everything that they can't carry with them. So they have a big fire sale. Brigham Young sends his son-in-law, Hiram B. Clausen, out to Camp Floyd, or Fort Crittenden at the time, gives him $40,000, and he says, Hiram, buy everything. So Hiram buys glass and nails and shingles and cloth and just everything except the adobe that the buildings was made out of, and hauls it all back in a lot of wagons. In fact, they buy so much stuff that Philip St. George Cook says, hey, as a thanks, and also a thanks for being kind to us while we were here, tell Brigham to take my flagpole, and he can have the flagpole from the fort. So they take the flagpole down, take it to the Beehive House, and erect the flagpole in front of Brigham Young's Beehive House. Take all the stuff back. Brigham Young says, we're going to have a fire sale, or an army going out of business sale, and they sell everything. They bought it on 10 cents on the dollar. They sell it for about 20 cents on the dollar. Brigham makes a cool $40,000 and builds the Salt Lake Theater with it. And so the United States Army effectively bought the first Salt Lake Theater that stayed in operation until well into the 20th century, just as an aside. As the Army is leaving, Brigham Young calls his counselor in the first presidency, Daniel H. Wells. The ROTC building here on campus is named the Daniel H. Wells building. And he calls Daniel H. Wells, and he doesn't refer to him as president, he calls him general. And he says, General, I need you to revitalize the Nauvoo Legion. The Nauvoo Legion came out, of course, Nauvoo. When they moved to Utah, it pretty well breaks down. They do some Indian skirmishes, but not much is going on. In 1861, they now have a whole bunch of Army blue uniform cloth. They make great uniforms. You can see the officer in front there on the left is decked out like an officer at the time. Utah's militia probably had the best dressed officers anywhere in the nation because they bought all that cloth for 10 cents on the dollar. And two individuals in the militia become prominent here in a few minutes. First is Colonel Robert T. Burton. He's a cavalry commander of a regiment. And then one of his subordinate battalion commanders, Lot Smith. This is the same Lot Smith who burned the Army's wagons during the Utah War. If you know that story, it's a fun thing. But they revitalized the Nauvoo Legion, or the Utah Militia, as it's sometimes called. And then Brigham offers up to the War Department, he says, I have thousands of soldiers available at your call. All you have to do is to call. And we'll see they lose his number. They don't ever really call, except once. So from the fall of 1861, when the Army leaves, till the spring of 1862, it's anarchy on the trails. The Indians are smart, and they watch the Army march out of Salt Lake. And in fact, as the Army marches out, they do it in several detachments. And one of the last detachments that's guarding several hundred head of cattle doesn't have enough guards, and the Indians swipe all the cattle. And it's a real insult to the Army that they can't even protect their cattle. And so they leave very quietly. And Brigham is ecstatic, as are the leaders of the church, because now the Army is gone. This invading force that came in 1857 has left us. How wonderful, they're gone. Well, during that time, things start to get really bad on the trail. And so from April to August, we have two events that occur. These are the only Utah Territory Civil War military units that participate. Okay, the only ones from Utah. Now, there are lots of Latter-day Saints who serve in other units outside, but the Utah Territory only provides two units, and the first is a state unit, and the second is a federal U.S. Army active duty unit. Robert T. Burton, the guy there on the left, he's a really interesting guy. He's the sheriff of Salt Lake City. If you know anything about the Morrisites, he's the guy that goes up and cleans out the Morrisites up in Ogden. They were an apostate group of Latter-day Saints and during the Civil War. And he later becomes a member of the presiding bishopric, serves in the presiding bishopric for several decades. But he gets involved because he is a regimental commander in the Nauvoo Legion. And this is a picture of him. He's in his 80s here. This is not how he looked when he was out riding on the trail, but he still fit into his uniform, for which I'm impressed. And the governor of the state, the acting governor named Fuller, requests assistance from the mail company. And the mail company says, drop dead. We got bigger problems. The Indians are burning our telegraph stations. They're killing our stagecoach drivers. They're burning the mail. They're scattering the mail. We got bigger problems. We can't come help you in Utah. And so the governor asks Brigham Young, who goes to Daniel Wells, who assigns Robert T. Burton, Colonel Burton, to set up a posse to escort a couple of folks to the east and to clean up the mail and to do some other things, because Chauncey West is going on a mission, and William Hooper, our delegate to Congress, has to return to Congress to try and lobby for some issues regarding a statehood request. And so they go out. This is from Brigham Young's journal and diary that was kept for him, and it talks about how the sheriff with two baggage wagons head out, and they then go out and take care and serve during April and May. But again, they're just a state unit. Interestingly, Washington is starting to take notice of Utah, because what's happening is the Indians aren't just messing with the mail and the stagecoach. They're cutting the telegraph lines. And what you have to understand is we have the nation, we have these states on the East Coast, and then we have a big gap, and we have California. California becomes a state in 1850 for one reason. They have gold. And they're bankrolling the Union War effort. And the Confederacy wants California and is making overtures for it. The only way that the Union has of keeping touch with California and what's going on there is the telegraph. And so because the telegraph is being cut and is at risk, Washington starts to take notice of Utah territory because we control a huge amount of telegraph line. They are a little concerned about the mail, but not nearly as much. They want to quell secession. They want a Union presence, and that becomes key. They want a Union presence in Utah because they call the Army back. And way down the list, they're concerned about folks that are emigrating. What's often not well known is that emigration picks up during the Civil War. There are up to 17,000 Latter-day Saints that emigrate just to Utah. That's not folks to California and Washington and Oregon. There's a lot of folks on the plains, and wouldn't you leave if your homeland's being burned and attacked and people are fighting over it? So a lot of pioneers head west. If the Saints were to order this list, they would flip this probably upside down, and Brigham, I think, would put emigration first on the list. He wanted security for the Saints that were coming to Zion, especially those from Great Britain. But 3 weeks after Robert Burton heads out and with his assignment to escort those folks to the east, a chain of events occurs. This guy, his name is Holliday, he owns the mail contract. He cares that the mail and telegraph goes through because he gets paid for every letter delivered. If the letters don't get delivered, he doesn't get paid. So he cares very much. He goes to Washington and contacts his buddy, Congressman Latham from California. Note that it's from California, which the Union needs. Latham goes to his good friend in the White House, Abraham Lincoln, and says, we need a force from Utah to protect the trail. We don't have enough regular soldiers in the Army. They're all fighting here in the east. We need a unit from Utah. So Lincoln tells the War Department, and the War Department tells a general by the name of Thomas, who's the adjutant, that he is to contact Utah. Now you'd think, since Lincoln has appointed a governor in Utah, you'd think that he would have the War Department contact the governor. No, he knows how things work in Utah. Thomas is to contact Brigham Young. So Thomas telegraphs Brigham Young on the 28th of April, 1862, and Brigham Young, within a matter of a couple of hours, goes to his first counselor, Daniel H. Wells, and he sends him this letter. And he addresses him as, note there, Lieutenant General Daniel H. Wells. It's not President Wells. It's always General Wells when he's wearing his Nauvoo Legion hat. And he notes that Lincoln has specifically asked for, the President of the United States, there in the second line, has asked for one company of cavalry for 90 days' service, and it's at the express direction of the President. This is done within just a matter of hours of Lincoln receiving the telegram. He receives the telegram at like 7 or 8 at night. By 9 o'clock, he has this letter written. Now, just an aside again, I think historical footnotes are always fun. I learned something new after Civil War Saints came out. I was reading through some of the journals of Brigham Young. The very day that Brigham Young receives that telegram from the War Department at Lincoln's direction, this guy, John Dunyan, who is the Surgeon General for the Nauvoo Legion, has gone to Brigham Young's house and pulled the last 5 teeth in Brigham's head. As Brigham is drafting this letter, he has to be in a huge amount of pain because there's no Novocaine. It's just grab the pliers and lose the teeth. And so I just imagine whoever is scribing this letter having to very patiently listen as Brigham tries to mouth that, as his mouth is swollen. Just another historical aside, he gets false teeth at this point within a few weeks, and it's the acting governor of the state of Utah that makes them for him because he used to be a dentist before he was appointed by Lincoln to be the governor. So everything kind of twists up in Utah in the 1860s. But then Wells, Daniel H. Wells, takes that letter, and then he wants to have Robert Burton command that unit because Burton is just competent. But Burton's already been sent out to escort the folks east. So they turn to Burton's battalion commander, Lot Smith. And they assign Lot Smith. He meets with Lot Smith on the evening of the 28th or 29th. And by the 1st of May, the unit is on the march. This is just unheard of. This is 1862. They are able to raise 106 soldiers, equip them, horses, ammunition, and send them on their way in 2 days. Brigham waits until the unit is in motion, heading up the canyon, until he telegraphs back to General Thomas to say, mission complete, they're on their way. And this is a painting done by Frank Thomas, an artist that lives in central Utah, of the Lotsmith Company heading out. As they head out, there's so much snow, and this is the 1st of May. There's so much snow, they just don't make any headway at all. They travel only a couple of miles. In fact, it's such little headway, but with wagons and horses, they beat such a good trail that Brigham and the First Presidency, the very next day, ride up behind them and give them what's called the Canyon Discourse. This is part of the Canyon Discourse. Brigham Young talks to them as a military unit, and he says, although you're soldiers, you're still members of the church, guys. This is very similar to what he said to them in his 1846 address before the Mormon battalion leaves. And he says, we have vowed to preserve the Union, and the best way to accomplish this is for you to shun all evil. And then Brigham Young continued, remember your prayers. And other comments on this unit talk about how this cavalry unit from Utah would meet morning and night together and have prayer. It's probably the only unit in the entire Civil War that does that. But Brigham also challenges them to establish peace with the Indians and to give ready obedience to the orders of your commanding officers. And then Brigham makes this last statement. He says, if you'll do this, I promise you, as a servant of the Lord, it's a prophet speaking, that not one of you shall fall by the hand of an enemy. That had to be a real comfort to that group, because as they were heading off, they had no idea what they were going to face. Well, they do leave in 10 feet of snow. There are 106 soldiers. There's another, dozen or so of harriers. Those are folks that take care of the harnesses and things, as well as teamsters, those that drive the wagon. They're not actually technically veterans. They're considered as contractors. But one of the soldiers, a private by the name of Harvey Coe-Hollinger, makes this statement. He said, only the Latter-day Saints could have surmounted these difficulties and remained cheerful. What he's not saying here is it's a miserable ride. It's 10 feet of snow, and they're trying to take horses and wagons through it, and it's uphill through the canyon. It's horrible. They get out on the trail, they pass Fort Bridger, get out into the Overland Trail, they hook up with Lieutenant Colonel Collins, who's from the 11th Ohio Cavalry. Collins works for a general named Craig, who's charged with guarding the entire trail, basically, with a regiment or two. It's an unwieldy task, and he's just thrilled to have another 100 people on the trail. This is not a photograph of them, but it's a period photograph doing things similar to what they would do. They cut lots of logs. They meet up with Burton's unit in May, and at one point they are crossing what's called the Shoshone Falls on the Snake River. This is part of the Shoshone Falls. You can see this is really treacherous water. As they're crossing, a young 19-year-old kid by the name of McNichol, his horse is spooked. He rears in the water and knocks McNichol into the water, and his body's never found again. So he's the only casualty of the Lotsmith Company, but notice what Brigham said, not one of you will fall by the hand of an enemy. And so Brigham's prophecy was indeed fulfilled. Well, these are the kind of things the Lotsmith Company does. They never see another Confederate, or they never see a Confederate, not another. They never see a Confederate, and the only action they have is against Indians. And they do lots of things like securing the mail and building bridges, because Brigham tells them, fix the road, make it easier for the immigrant companies. And they do. They do a great job doing all of that. Well, this is after the war. This is produced by that Grand Army of the Republic. Where's Utah? We provided active duty soldiers. We're not on the list. And that's kind of the attitude that carries even during the war, because there are only 90 days. Well, let me briefly tell you the story of the establishment of Camp Douglas, because the Army says we need an Army presence to protect the trail and mostly to protect the telegraph. So they go to Colonel Patrick Edward Connor. He's a commander of California Volunteers. And they say, Connor, move out for Utah. Brigham Young hears that the Army is on the march again, and he is not happy. General Craig, out on the trail, telegraphs Brigham Young and says, I want your guys for another 100 days. They're awesome. These are the best soldiers I've got. Can I have them another 100 days? Brigham has just learned that Connor and the California Volunteers are marching to occupy Utah, as he sees it. And he writes back and says, the time isn't, well, actually the governor writes back and says, the time isn't right. Locksmiths Company's just not going to serve anymore. And so they come back to Salt Lake and are released. Connor comes in. He dresses up in civilian clothes, and mufti is the term, great word, and walks around Salt Lake City for a few days, gets the lay of the land, decides he's not going back to Fort Crittenden because nothing was left. I mean, they stripped everything. And he decides he's going to place an army fort overlooking Salt Lake, as he says, to keep an eye on the Latter-day Saints. And to show his disdain, this man hates Mormons. Turns out Brigham ends up hating him, so it's a fair exchange. And they never meet, by the way. Strangely enough, they hate each other deeply and never meet. But he names the fort after Stephen A. Douglas. And this is just another stick in Brigham's eye. Because Stephen A. Douglas, if you know that famous prophecy from Joseph Smith telling him not to raise his hand against the Latter-day Saints, Stephen A. Douglas, before he dies during the election, calls Latter-day Saints an ulcer, a social ulcer on the body politic, or something very similar to that. And so that ulcer comment sticks in the throat of the Latter-day Saints, as well it should. But Connor names this fort Douglas, and it's still Fort Douglas to this very day, but it's named as an insult to the Latter-day Saints. These are pictures from Fort Douglas as they start building the buildings there. That's the band from the Civil War times. Indians relations at the time. Now the Army is back in Utah. And these two guys have very differing views on the Indians. Brigham Young's approach is feed them, give them some clothes. It's cheaper to give them $1 worth of food than to fight them and to kill them and to have them kill you. Let's just feed them and be friends. His policy is so effective that most Indian tribes in the territory of Utah have two words for white men. There are Americans and there are Mormons. And if you are an American, they do not trust you. And if you are a Mormon, then you're their friend. And it's very common across most of the tribes, that difference between Mormons and Americans. Connor's approach is typical military mid-19th century. Only good Indian's a dead Indian. I'm going to take this by force. And their differing Indian policies come to a head up here outside of Preston, Idaho, and on January 29, 1863. It's called at the time the Battle of Bear River. We refer to it today as the Bear River Massacre. Over 300 Indian men, women, and children are simply massacred. It's a slaughter. There's only about a loss of about 18 soldiers. Connor himself personally leads the attack. This is one of the largest Indian massacres in the history of the United States, but it gets completely swept under the rug and off the radar because the Civil War is going on. When you're having battles like Antietam with 53,000 dead in a 24 or 36-hour period, what's a couple hundred Indians in Utah territory is the approach. And most of the newspapers in the East do not even mention the battle. It just doesn't get any mention at all. The War Department takes note, though, because it's calming down the trail and keeping the telegraph secure, because the Indians completely buckle and they all sign treaties afterwards. Connor is promoted to Brigadier General for personally commanding the attack. So for the massacre, he is rewarded with a star. He makes he gets a second star before he retires. Well, very briefly here, Utah is fair game during the Civil War for the press of both the North and the South. Because in that time, what you do is you'd publish an article, and then you would send your newspapers to other newspapers, and articles they liked, they would reprint. And they would say something like from the New York Times, or from the New York Herald, or the Washington Union, or whatever it might be. Copyright laws were much different. Well, when the war breaks out, they can no longer do that with political news. And so they've lost most of their political news. But Mormons are safe. Both the North and the South have a distrust and a curiosity about Mormons, so they trade articles about Mormons all the time. And so it fills their newspapers up, and there are hundreds and hundreds of articles across the North and South. Let me just give you, there are four main themes that these articles are about. Mormon loyalty, which is always in doubt. Utah's quest for statehood. Polygamy, which just fascinates the East. And Brigham Young. They just can't figure this guy out. So let me just give you a couple of samples of these. These are some of the headlines, just to give you kind of a feel for what's going on. You know, what shall we do with the Mormons? It's a problem, and they see it as a problem after the war. But here's an article from 1861, talking about a 4th of July parade in Salt Lake City that's 1.5 miles long, proclaiming our allegiance to the Union and the nation. It has floats, as it says here, about the Constitution, the spirit of 1776, the Declaration of Independence, Union forever, and then the newspaper writer who's in Salt Lake adds this statement. You know, it's difficult to judge whether the North or the South really has the preponderance. I just really don't understand. It was only a 1.5-mile parade supporting the Union. I can't figure this out. Here's a northern view. The removal of the small force from Utah. This is right as the word's coming out, they're going to pull the Army back. The removal of the small force from Utah will prove a fatal blunder. It'll leave the great overland routes to California and Oregon unprotected and invite aggression, both from lawless Mormons and hostile Indians. You got to watch them both. Well, here's a southern view. This is from Savannah, the Daily Morning News. We hope Brother Brigham will give the Yankees as much trouble as possible. They, the North, are no better than the Mormons. Oh, we're fighting the North. We hate those guys. But they're no better than the Mormons, though they, the North, conceal their rascality a little more. So here they are. They're fighting the North, and they hate the church worse. Go figure. Well, some more headlines. War with the Saints. I mean, these are all during the Civil War. The exciting news from Utah, from the New York Times there in the middle, of the collision between the military and the Mormons, that's over that flagpole that Phillips and George Cook gave to Brigham Young that he mounted at the Beehive House. Connor thinks that Brigham Young has stolen the flagpole after the Army left, and some of Brigham's aides fly the flag at half-staff one day, and Connor takes it as an insult to the government, and the church and the military almost go to war in March 1863. It's called March Madness by several historians. Predates basketball by a long shot. They come very close to war. Brigham mobilizes 5,000 Nauvoo Legion members, and Connor rolls out the cannons and is ready. It comes very close to an attack, and then cooler heads prevail, but it's over that flagpole. So at the same time that this is going on, Utah, which has requested statehood several times in the past, does it again. 1862, the governor leaves the state that previous New Year's Eve because he's caught with a woman, not his wife, and so he fears for his life, and he scoots out. His name is Dawson. So Fuller becomes the acting governor. While we have an acting governor and not a real governor, the legislature meets together, declares they want to be a state, elects Brigham Young governor of the state of Deseret, elects a separate legislature. They meet, they start passing laws, and they send to Hooper in Washington, D.C., information that they want to apply again for statehood. Well, as fate has it, that request for statehood works its way up through Congress at the same time that the Morrill Anti-Bigamy Act does. Guess which one makes it all the way? And they pass the Anti-Bigamy Act and shelve the request for statehood again. I love this statement, though, from William Hooper, our representative in Congress. We show our loyalty by trying to get in, while others are trying to get out. This is the same time that South Carolina is seceding. This newspaper article appears in the New York Times in 1862 during that election. Utah's petitioned in vain. Oregon, with half the population, is now a state. Why? Why not Utah? Because they're poor, darn Mormons. And that was sufficient. And now the national government has tied the hands of the people of Utah so they can't render any help. See, Brigham has those thousands of Nauvoo militiamen, Nauvoo Legion militia, Utah militiamen that are waiting to be called, and they're just never called. And then he withdraws the offer after the Army comes back. Again, polygamy, just all kinds of real interest in this, this experience the saints are having. Here's one that appears in the Raleigh, North Carolina Register. If the Confederate draft law is passed, we will have to introduce Mormonism. They meant polygamy, for the benefit of that portion of the community and the good of the state. So if they take our men and draft them, we're going to have to go to polygamy. We'll have to be like Mormons. This is my favorite quote from the Civil War newspapers. The prettiest girls in Utah generally marry young. I just think that's just charming with that capital Y. Somebody at Chattanooga got a good laugh over that one, I think. Well, here's a newspaper prediction that the Boston Herald made, not one of their more prescient comments. When Brigham Young sleeps with his fathers, we predict the whole Mormon fabric will crumble to dust. It may and doubtless will continue to exist as a religious sect, but as a compact and tremendously effective organization, its power will cease when Brigham Young's heart is forever still. I didn't do well on that one. There's lots of other stories we could talk about, giving you a kind of a feel for what's happening in Utah. We could talk more about how the Utah War sets up the Civil War. Most of the battles in the Civil War have participants and soldiers and often commanding generals whose last major deployment was in Utah Territory at Camp Floyd. The logistics that they use are tested at Camp Floyd. The tents, the weapons are tested at Camp Floyd. Camp Floyd becomes the proving and testing ground for the Civil War. It's not widely recognized, but it's a fact. We could talk about what happens with emigration. We could talk about the Nauvoo Legion during the war. We could talk about how after the war, now that slavery has been defeated, the Republican Congress turns its eyes on what they called in 1856 at their first national convention, the twin pillars of barbarism, twin relics of barbarism, excuse me. The first is slavery, the second is polygamy. And so the Civil War ends slavery, and now they turn their eye on polygamy, and there's basically a war on the saints until polygamy ends in 1890. We could talk about the Grand Army of the Republic and how Latter-day Saints in Utah are not welcome as members. And it takes until 1909 until they let members of the Lot Smith Company join the Grand Army of the Republic, even though they're veterans. All kinds of stories that we could share. Well, let me just mention a couple of things. There are lots of Latter-day Saint veterans. I will just give you the numbers here. We found 310 soldiers and sailors who fought for the Union. We found 71 Confederates. And we found 3 special guys that are called galvanized Yankees. To galvanize a piece of metal is you take something like a piece of steel and you dip it in zinc so it doesn't rust. But inside, if you scratch the zinc off, it's still steel. And so if you galvanize a Yankee, you take a Confederate and you dip him in Yankee blue, and he's still a Confederate at heart, but he's now serving for the Yankees. And 3 of these were Latter-day Saints, and it tells the story in Civil War Saints of one of these really interesting guys. Well, let me mention one of these veterans. This is a Utah veteran. This guy's name is John Rosa. He starts out in the Austrian army and the Hungarian army, being a European. He deserts from both those armies. He's put on a ship and sent to the New World. He gets to New York, becomes a waiter, picks a fight with the owner, not a wise idea. He gets unemployed again, decides it wasn't so bad in the army that I deserted from, so he joins the American Army. Gets shipped out to Camp Floyd during the Utah War. Goes on vacation or leave one day and sees a cute little girl. This is her later in life, by the name of Patience Loader. You may recognize Patience Loader. She's played by this young lady in the movie 17 Miracles. It's her family that comes from England, and her sister, it's her sister, John Rose's sister-in-law, who's so heartbroken, and she has the dream about the man she's going to marry. That's this family. He meets her. She's a survivor of the Willie Martin Handcart Company. They get married right before the Civil War. When the Army's ordered back east, they travel back east. He serves in Washington, D.C. They're trying to return to Utah after the war, and he dies on the plains. And then she remarries. Just all kinds of interesting stories. Well, I want to share with you, just in closing, let me share just a couple of things. The first is this statement that just makes me shake my head every time I read it, from the New York Times. This is a statement at the end of the war. The New York Times editor says, "It is my firm belief that in the spring of 1861, South Carolina was more loyal to the Union than Utah is today." Now let's think about that for just a second. In the spring of 1861, South Carolina has seceded from the Union. They have raised an army against the federal government. They have fired on the Star of the West. They have fired on Fort Sumter, and they are actively attacking Union forces. Yet those guys in South Carolina, according to the New York Times, are more loyal than the Mormons in Utah in 1865. That's a really, really interesting statement. They believe that even with the telegraph, even as loud as we protest out here, that we are loyal. They see us, as it says here, in open rebellion against the United States. Well, the Civil War doesn't end with the Civil War, as you know. In many places in the South, it's still being fought even today. But there's a couple of stories from Utah that do play. In 1909, the Grand Army of the Republic has its national encampment. That's its national meeting in Salt Lake City. This ribbon that's on the right is actually on exhibit out here. It was given to the project by a dentist in Ohio, not a Latter-day Saint, when he heard about this project. And you can see that. It's a great, great example. It's in pristine condition. But somehow, the delegates and Grand Army of the Republic members convinced the entire organization at the 1908 encampment to hold their national encampment here. And Joseph F. Smith, the First Presidency, the Quorum of the 12, and basically all the saints in Salt Lake pitch in to make this an extremely memorable event for the veterans. They go all out. They open their homes, they house the veterans, they just take, the church sponsors coffee bars, which is probably one of the few times they've done that. Just trying to support the veterans. And it's a great experience, and interestingly, and I'm sure not coincidentally, that's right about the time they let the Lotsmith Cavalry Unit join the Grand Army of the Republic. 4 years later, in 1913, in July, Utah sends individuals back who are living in Utah, veterans, both Confederates, mostly Union, but some Confederates, back to the 50th anniversary of Gettysburg. And there's some really interesting stories there. Ken Nelson, a researcher and employee up at the Family History Department, and I have got an article coming out in the Utah Historical Quarterly in July on the 100th anniversary that talks about that. And just some really fascinating stories about the folks that were able to attend that reunion. So the war ends but doesn't end. I want to end, though, with a poem. This is from a guy by the name of Charles E. Nash. This was a very popular Grand Army of the Republic poem, and it's to Union soldiers, but I think it applies to Confederates as well. Soon these glad reunions here will be forever past. The broken ranks that close the rear will cross the ford at last. But on the world's illustrious page of heroes tried and true will live enshrined from age to age the glorious boys in blue. I think we do honor to these great veterans as we remember them, especially in this sesquicentennial time of the Civil War, as it's been 150 years that have passed, as they gave up so much for the freedoms that we enjoy today. And I'm happy to entertain any questions if you have any for a moment or two, or we can take them afterwards. But I just want to bury my testimony. Brigham's a prophet, and it comes through during the war. Several times he gives counsel that just common sense wouldn't have told him to say that, and counsel he gives to soldiers and others, and he's always dead on. And I just leave that with you in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. Okay.
So you have about 5 minutes for questions.
I do.
Any questions?
I apologize, it's not longer than that, but my wife and I had a temple, so. Any questions at all? Just a quick comment on Thomas L. Kane. Thomas L. Kane brokers the end of the Utah War. He then served in the Civil War and is promoted to general, and is very seriously wounded, and walks with a limp, and almost dies from his wounds during the war. Really interesting guy. His brother, by the way, is probably the most famous American, and which is one of the reasons he gets such access to the president and is able to do all these things. His brother was an explorer and was very, very, very famous, and so he came from quite a.
His father was a federal judge.
And his father was
Yeah.
a federal judge in the East Coast, in Philadelphia, as I recall, or
Yeah.
that area.
Yeah, that area.
But really interesting. Yes.
Tell us about the end of Connor's life, if you can.
Yeah, Connor's a really interesting guy. This is a guy who hates Utah, who hates Salt Lake, who hates Brigham Young, hates Mormons. He makes two-star general, and he's encouraged basically to retire towards the end of the Civil War. He leaves Utah and realizes he likes Utah, and he comes back, and he dies here. He founds he is the father of Utah mining. If you look it up online, he's known as the father of Utah mining because he figures the way to undermine the saints is to find gold or silver or precious metals, and it will bring miners into the state, which actually happens because we've got so many mineral deposits here. And so he's the guy that starts that. He instructs his officers during the Civil War, yeah, keep an eye on the Indians, but when you got spare time, go looking for metals. And they actually start several mines during his soldiers do, and some of them get some cash on the side from that. He's buried in Salt Lake at Mount Olivet Cemetery, and he also is foundational in establishing the Grand Army of the Republic here following the war, and so that's part of the reason that Latter-day Saints are not able to join, is because Connor's way deep into that and still doesn't like Latter-day Saints. Yes?
What was the reaction? I remember you saying that the governor at the time, when Abraham Lincoln asked that he send more troops, they went straight to Brigham Young. What was that relationship between Brigham Young and the governor at the time?
Well, he's the acting governor, and so he's not fully the governor, so he doesn't have that full cloak of authority. He recognizes how things work. There's no formal complaints that I've seen. I'm sure it rankles him a bit, but he doesn't complain in any public forum that I know of. And actually, he's probably quite glad, because Brigham is able to get that thing done in 2 days. If it had gone through the state, it would have taken months, as we see from the way legislatures tend to work. Yes?
Are you continuing to add to that list of Utah veterans?
Yes, actually, in the book, and as I should have mentioned that, we are actually, yes, we are very much adding to it, and we have added to it. We've added a couple of Confederates, more Union, but we checked, let me see if I can show you here. Let's see, it's going to be about slide 57. Let's see if that's, okay, these are some of the veterans. These are, let's see, okay, here, let me see if I can find it. These are some of the veterans that we found. We've got others, but people are just sending us information because we just couldn't find everybody. What I'm looking for here is, let's see, there's already, this is my little research team, and most of these folks have graduated now, that we hunted through everything we could find. We went through census records and Park Service records and National Archives, but we know we haven't found everybody. You contact me, just alford@byu.edu, and I'll be happy to take that. Please.
Have you made any attempt to identify non-LDS veterans, Civil War veterans living in Utah?
No, there's too many. Mining brings in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. If you look at the 1890 census itself was destroyed, but there's a schedule called the Veterans Schedule. And only Union veterans, a huge mistake. They didn't ask Confederates to do it. But for Union veterans, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of names just from Utah from 1890 of veterans that were living here at that point. And no, we've not. That would take what we did, and it would be about 10 times worse, or better, depending on your perspective. But 10 times more expensive from the research perspective. And plus, a lot of those veterans are moving in and out, so how long do they have to live here before we'd count them, and so on. We did count, I will tell you, that 384 I gave you, that's anybody that's Latter-day Saint during their entire lifetime. So some of them joined the church after the war, but we still counted them as Latter-day Saint. What we did not count is we had a good sister from Texas who wrote me and said, I have 2,200 Civil War veterans, and come to find out she was counting vicarious baptisms. And if that's the case, there's 2.8 million Union LDS veterans, or will be eventually. Probably one last question, if anybody's got one. Yes, please.
How reliable is the statement about plowing around the log? I've heard that it comes second-hand or third-hand. Is that true, or does it come from?
It's in chapter, I can refer you to chapter 4. That chapter was written by Mary Jane Woodger, and I know she's footnoted. I did not bring a copy of the book with me, but I would refer you, and if you want to slip over into the bookstore and just look at it, just open it up. It's the page 1 of chapter 4 is where it's at, but I don't recall. Oh, when the book is burned into my brain for all time, and so I would just refer you there. Also, if you're interested, you may the chief curator at the Springfield Lincoln Library is Bishop Andresen. He's LDS. And Brian is his name, but he's a bishop back there, and he'd be helpful on that question as well. Okay, well, great. Well, thank you very much. Have a great day.